Okay, over
Right.
to you, Alessandra.
Thank you so much, Dina, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's really my pleasure to present. I think it is very interesting summer winter school, and as you can see on the title, I'm going to provide you with a few insights on biosafety measures, technology risks, and how they impact on the World Trade Organization and more generally how they're impacting on our lives. Um, so um, even if I'm well aware that all of you know what food is, allow me to take a step back and briefly remind us this. So food is not just the result of a cultivation process, as food is also history, as a family, as it is a way to stay together. Food is also a means to share different opinions and try to find a common ground. And food is also part of religions, and for some cultures, food, we can say, is a religion, and the Italians knows and can confirm that food is not just the hallmark of I mean, it is. It's just the center of a culture. Um, I would, um, I mean, today food is, we can say, is also the result of a genetic manipulation of a DNA labs by means of, it is called biotechnology. So let's see where, yeah, here we go. So, but what is biotechnology? Biotechnology, which literally is technology based on biology, uses an organism or a component of an organism or other biological system to make a product or process. Genetically modified organisms are the most common products of biotech industry, and as you can see on the slide, a WTO panel in the EC biotech case defined a GMO as an animal, plant, or other organism whose genetic structure has been modified by genetic engineering. It's quite slow. Let's see why I cannot move to. Yeah. So if GMOs are a positive or rather a negative asset for our community is still highly debated. And that's the reason why GMOs are still considered a Pandora box in 2023. So the question is, what's wrong with GMOs and more generally with biotech products? So the problem is that these products might have serious and sometimes irreversible impacts on human health and the environment. Specifically, the most significant adverse effects of biotech products on human health are allergenicity to a novel gene product, antibiotic resistance, and health issues caused by the increased use of agriculture pesticides on GM crops. Biotech products can also cause environmental degradation through the use of pesticides that, in the view of some scientists, I have to say, seem to increase with GM crops. Also, the introduction of GM animals into natural environment can cause the proliferation of invasive GM species, which can cause damage to biodiversity and have unanticipated impact on known target species. But on the other side, biotech can help to improve the production of food, especially through GM crops. So biotech products are accordingly be seen by someone as a valid means to mitigate world hunger and also to support the enhancement of the right to food. Also, international trade in biotech products can present significant economic opportunities, especially for developing countries. I inserted in these slides a few data. from 1996 to 2016, with the commercialization of biotech products, Argentina gained 23.7 billion of American dollars. India earned 21.1 billion, and Brazil gained 19.8 billion, which are quite a numbers. So it is important to emphasize that international trade in biotech products can magnify both benefits and risks, if only because trade is a means to reach a large number of consumers around the world. Therefore, the judiciary of the WTO, which is the only international organization operating the global system of trade rules and helping developing countries to build their trade capacity, is in the middle of a polarized debate where requests for free trade in biotech products are limited by requests for ensuring biosafety from the adverse impacts in trading this kind of a product. Biotech is, however, certainly not the only technology presenting benefits and risks, but what makes the analysis of GMOs particularly interesting is the high degree of remaining scientific uncertainty regarding both benefits and risks of trading GMOs on this slide. And on this slide, you can see just a few examples. So considering all pros and cons, along with the remaining high level of scientific uncertainty on the international trade in biotech products, I would say that a pertinent question is how to find a point of equilibrium between the revolutionary advancement offered by technology and the need to safeguard biosafety from uncertain, though potentially reversible, technology risks in trading technology products. And finding a point of equilibrium requires decision makers, in this case, WTO judicial bodies, to strike a recent balance between free trade and no-trade interest. This is, however, unlikely in trade context because of the presence of two main kinds of issues, normative and epistemic issues. As regards the normative issues, it must be immediately stressed that the WTO normative framework was not drafted with the full complexity of biotechnology issues in mind. Well, for example, if just we think the SPS agreement, along with a number of other agreements that apply to biotech cases, have been ratified in 1994. And the second normative issue concerns the existence of what I called an implicit prima facie preeminence of free trade under the WTO. So at this point, someone might think that having a bias for trade interest under the WTO would not be so unreasonable, if only because WTO is the international organization fostering free trade. Although this reasoning would be quite understandable, it would not be the result of a legal interpretation of the WTO normative framework. This is because the preeminence of free trade interest under the WTO does not echo the preamble of the WTO agreement, which does not set a hierarchy between WTO goals. Rather, the preamble lists several paramount objectives. It has to be noted by a few scholars that free trade is neither the only nor the overriding purpose. Actually, the term does not appear at all in the preamble to the WTO agreement. So because of this implicit priority given to trade values under the WTO states find difficult to respect international obligations in relation to the protection of human health and the environment under the international human rights and international environmental law frameworks. This is because taking a measure to protect health and the environment can be both required by human rights law or international environmental law, and at the same time forbidden or at least not supported by WTO norms. So this begs the question of whether WTO law supplement or actually is in tension with international human rights and international environmental law. And to answer this question, we have to briefly discuss the concept of normative conflicts or normative antinomies. And to do so, we are going to analyze the most relevant environmental obligations on most WTO states, as there are thousands of international environmental treaties enshrining different environmental obligations. Today, my focus will be on some environmental obligations aiming at preventing or addressing the loss of biological diversity that, as I explained before, can be caused by the international trade in biotech products. And it is quite evident that preventing the loss of biological diversity is of paramount importance, even because this loss can adversely affect the enjoyment of a number of fundamental human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, and water. It is hardly surprising that there are several obligations on almost all WTO states to protect biodiversity. These obligations include the adoption of a precautionary approach, conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and adoption of affirmative governance actions to address risks for the loss of biological diversity. So now we are going to discuss each of them. So obligation to prevent loss of biological diversity and to adopt a precautionary approach. Well, at the Earth Summit in 1992, all WTO states, except the US, signed the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, which enshrines the precautionary principle. I'm not sure if you are all familiar with this principle, but according to Principle 15, in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. And where there are threats of serious and or irreversible damage, lack of a full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures for to prevent environmental degradations. Also, we have the Convention of Biological Diversity, the CBD, which stresses the vital importance of anticipating, preventing, and attacking the causes of the significant reduction or loss of biological diversity at source. And the vast majority of WTO member states are also parties to the CBD. So in a nutshell, the adoption of a precautionary approach takes a central role in protecting biodiversity. Nevertheless, giving practical effects to these international legal commitments is not a simple task for WTO states, because, well, there are a number of reasons that we are going to discuss today. One of these is the judicial reluctance towards the implementation of precautionary measures in trade context. I can mention a few examples. In Australia's salmon case, the panel rejected the Australian government's request to implement a precautionary ban on fresh, chilled, or frozen salmon to protect domestic salmon from disease. In another case, in Japan agriculture products too, the Japanese government's precautionary request to protect certain agriculture products from the risks posed by the international, from the introduction of a rare species of insect was found to be non-compliant with WTO law. As such, the request for implementing precautionary measures was denied. And in a more recent case in EC Biotech, the EU failed to implement a precautionary ban on certain genetically modified products. That the EU wanted to ban. We have also obligations to ensure conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. Preventing the loss of biological diversity is intrinsically linked to a need to adopt sustainable practices and use of biological diversity. And in this respect, the CBD and the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety and also the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair of and the equitable sharing of benefits are only three of many international treaties requiring states parties, including, of course, several WTO states, to ensure conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. And these obligations align with the goal of achieving sustainable development, which is acknowledged as a WTO goal and enshrined in a plethora of international instruments that, although not legally binding, have received, I would say, strong political support. The Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety and the Nagoya Protocol also require states to take affirmative governmental interventions to address biological diversity loss. And the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety enshrines the obligation to regulate, manage, and control risks associated with the use, handling, and transboundary movement of living modified organisms by establishing and maintaining appropriate mechanisms, measures, and strategies. Also, the Nagoya Protocol imposes the duty to restore biological diversity. If we wanted to focus on the marine environment, which is potentially threatened by the international trade in biotech product, which can be introduced in both terrestrial and marine environment, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea requires state parties to take all measures necessary to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment. So as you can see from these graphs, many of the contracting states of the CBD, the Cartagena Protocol, the Nagoya Protocol, and also UNCLOS are also WTO state members. So now let's see how WTO law ensures biodiversity by analyzing some WTO norms under the GET, SPS, and TBT agreement that seem to be designed to protect the environment and, more importantly, apply to biotech cases. The first example that I want to bring to your attention is the chapeau of Article 20, the general requirements to prevent unjustifiable trade limitations. It's the title of this norm. So, in a nutshell, under the GATT agreement, WTO states can adopt measures to minimize risks posed by international trade to human health and the environment in light of the general exceptions enshrined in Article 20, letter B and G. And the chapeau, otherwise known as the introductory paragraphs of such provision, highlight that protective measures triggered in the context of the GATT, SPS, and TBT agreements do not apply in a way that would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail, or a disguised restriction on international trade. So From these requirements, it is quite evident that the WTO states implementing protective measures must focus on reducing trade limitations rather than ensuring non-trade values such as environmental protection in trade contexts. So this seems to imply that trade liberalization has greater importance than the other WTO objectives, which are, again, listed in the preamble of the WTO agreement that established that WTO member states agree on trading with a view to raising standards of living, ensuring full employment and large and steadily growing volume of real income and effective demand, and expanding the production of and trade in goods and services, while allowing for the optimal use of the world's resources in accordance with the objective of a sustainable development, seeking both to protect and preserve the environment. So from this list, it is clear that there are equal WTO goals, and yet trade liberalization seems to have a greater importance than the other WTO objectives under the GATT agreement. Similarly, under the SPS and the TBT agreements, all member states' rights and obligations for adopting animal or plant health measures have a clear focus on preventing unjustified limitations to trade rather than protecting non-trade values. In this regard, it is sufficient to look at Article 2.2 of both agreements, according to which WTO states can apply sanitary and phytosanitary measures only to the extent necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. And in order to prove this necessity, strong evidence, scientific evidence is required. And this is despite of the fact that sometimes the presence of remaining scientific uncertainty makes it almost impossible. So a number of interesting, I would say, considerations stem from this comparison between international environmental law and WTO law frameworks. Well, first of all, it is evident that the focus of the WTO provisions aiming to ensure the environment trade context is on the reduction of trade limitations rather than ensuring non-trade values. As a consequence, while these international environmental legal obligations call for affirmative governmental interventions, WTO obligations are, by contrast, negative in the sense that they constrain governmental actions. And this is because trade agreements focus on environmental measures as potential impediments to international trade. Also, this makes it difficult for WTO member states to realize their obligations under multilateral environmental agreements and reflect a normative tension between international environmental law and the WTO law. So in other words, although WTO law permits member states to adopt measures protecting human health and the environment, economic interests seem to be implicitly more relevant than non-economic interests such as biosafety. So this means, again, that while in principle there is no explicit priority between WTO goals, implicitly trade has a preeminence, and this emerges not only from this comparison, but also from a number of shortfalls under the WTO, is what I called WTO gaps. Well, first of all, there's a WTO democracy deficit in relation to non-trade interest. As it is argued by a large number of scholars, WTO is characterized by a democratic deficit, meaning that WTO rules and dispute settlement undermine the ability of states to enact laws that reflect the democratic will of their people, to ensure the enhancement of non-trade interests such as human health and environmental protection. And this deficit can affect the capacity of states to ensure the protection of human health and the environment in biotech cases. And I would say more generally in health environment related disputes. So the root cause of such deficit might lie in the fact that the WTO negotiating teams have, I would say, have tended to represent a narrow range of interests and are not necessarily skilled at anticipating or appreciating the non-trade impact of trade deals. For example, in the field of human rights, environment, and health. The second gap is relates to the fact that the WTO range of criteria undermines the national sovereignty on human and environmental policies. Well, under the GATT, SPS, and TPT agreements, biosafety and more generally protective measures will breach WTO law if they do not meet a range of very narrow criteria. And these requirements are so stringent that member states' requests for adopting protective measures were, I would say, regularly rejected in almost all cases, raising environmental concerns from at least from 1991 to 2017. The final gap relates to the fact that the WTO lacks a process to challenge trade measures that turned out to adversely affect human health over the environment. For instance, facing biosafety loss caused by the introduction of some species of GM plants into the European market, there are no options under the WTO to challenge the WTO measures that allow the GM plants introduction into the environment, into the European market, and this is a quite considerable gap. So all these gaps indicate an evident bias towards the goal of trade liberalization that in turn has two main consequences. Well, first of all, it makes the achievement of the WTO goal of a sustainable development, I would say, unattainable. Indeed, the achievement of this goal rests on the lack of any hierarchy between economic growth, environmental protection, and social development, which are the three main pillars of sustainable development. And second, the priority given to trade values within the WTO, as I already said, undermines the capacity, the ability of states to respect international obligations in the non-trade arena. So international trade in biotech products, I would say, contributes to the loss of biodiversity, and nonetheless, the WTO legal framework, or more generally, WTO law does not adequately supplement international environmental obligations aiming to reduce or prevent such loss. And this creates what is called the normative antinomies between WTO law and the other international law regime. So here, another logical question is, why do we have this lack of harmonization between international law regimes? And the answer might lie in what scholars call the fragmentation of international law. Very briefly, the fragmentation of international law, well, is a topic of extensive scholarly debate. And according to a study group of the International Law Commission, the background to the concern about fragmentation of international law is the rise of specialized rules and rule systems that have no clear relationship to each other. However, scholars differ as to the sources of such fragmentation. Fragmentation of international law is, for instance, conceived as the result of the specialization of international legal regimes, described as a child of the decentralized structure of international law, or even considered the result of the fact that the states adopt different legal regimes, or deemed the consequence of states' difficulties managing regulatory measures. So two main approaches have been suggested as responses to fragmentation, a legal and a political approach. The legal approach refers to the adoption of interpretative legal principles, such as the principle of coherence and harmonization, or legal rules alleviating the effects of fragmentation, such as, for example, the techniques of the so-called lex specialis or lex posterioris. And also we have the political approach, which suggests the establishment of a structural hierarchies or a supreme court of international law. In addition to these two main approaches, some scholars suggest the adoption of proportionality and balancing, which are commonly referred to as proportionality analysis or proportionality balancing, in order to harmonize rules of different international law regimes. And the appeal of a proportionality lies in its accommodating character in the face of conflicting interests. And proportionality analysis can be seen as a valid tool to mitigate not only the fragmentation of international law, but also to mitigate more specifically the imbalance between trade rules and international environmental law obligation. So let's see what is proportionality analysis in more detail. So the requirement of proportionality is almost universally recognized. Proportionality lies at the core of justice, and this was already noted by Aristotle, according to whom the just is the proportional, the unjust is what violates the proportion. Nevertheless, defining proportionality is not a straightforward task. This is because there are several conceptions of proportionality. When conceived as a legal concept, proportionality, which the literature considers a principle, test, or sometimes analysis, is the criterion that decision makers use to justify decisions involving conflicting values, principles, rights, or interest. Proportionality is viewed as a doctrinal tool that can solve conflicts with mathematical precision by offering an arithmetic balance and an analytical framework guiding decision makers to evaluate, to assess competing rights, interests, and value. It is also defined as a goal of government and a model of optimization of values in conflicts. So despite the different conceptions of proportionality, the common denominator is the capacity of this criterion to solve cases concerning conflicting legal interests or principles. Additionally, it is agreed that the balancing is at the core of proportionality, and it represents the best way to resolve the tension between competing values. So what is the proportionality structure? In the view of most courts and also scholars, proportionality has a triadic structure that is supported by three tests: suitability, necessity, and balancing test. very briefly, the suitability test requires that a state measure must be appropriate to achieve the desired and the legitimate end. The necessity test requires the adoption of necessary measures, meaning the least restrictive and the least onerous among equally effective alternatives. And the last one is the balancing test, which requires the adoption of a measure that is not excessive or disproportionate in relation to the pursued objective. So by performing a well-structured proportionality analysis, the WTO decision makers would try to mitigate in their rulings the imbalance between WTO norms and international environmental law obligations. Therefore, I would say there is merit in performing proportionality analysis under the WTO. However, there are two remaining problems preventing the performance of a well-structured proportionality analysis. First of all, the WTO is seen as institutionally not ready for balancing economic and non-economic values, and nonetheless, such balancing is at the core of a proportionality analysis. And second, the competence of the WTO judicial bodies cannot ensure a recent balance between environmental and trade interest. So at this point, another question might be how to fill the WTO deficit in order to enable WTO judicial bodies to strike a proper balance between competing values, and in turn to mitigate the imbalance between trade rules and international environmental law obligations. And here, the jurist and the legal philosopher Robert Alexy, in a theory of constitutional rights, developed a conception of the structure of a balancing that can help answering our question. So according to Alexy, proportionality analysis is a valuable model to support a rational structure of judicial reasoning, and its importance lies into the fact that any judicial balance consists in nothing else than optimization relative to competing principles. So in Alexy's view, three elements form a rational structure of balancing: the law of balancing, the weight formula, and the burden of argumentation. And by considering these three elements, the judicial balance of competing rights or principles can become a rational procedure based on a well-structured proportionality analysis. So the law of balancing. So the law of balancing comprises and relates the three factors to be considered in any balancing process. These three factors included in the law of balancing are the abstract weight, the intensity of interference, and the reliability of empirical premises. So the abstract weight considers the possible different legal hierarchies between the competing principles or rights under examination. So it might be argued, for instance, that the right to life has a greater abstract weight than the right to development, if only because, unlike the right to development, the right to life is not derogable. The second element of the law of balancing is the intensity of interference, which stands for the intensity of interference by non-satisfaction of the principles or rights at stake. For instance, spraying GM crops with much more herbicides than the maximum amount allowed by the competent authorities would inevitably interfere with the enjoyment of the right to health of people living in areas surrounding fields of GM crops. And the third factor of the law of balancing is the reliability of empirical premises, in the sense of a certainty of the underlying empirical assumptions. reliability of empirical premises refers to the degree of knowledge of factual data of a real, of a concrete case. So this is the first, the law of balancing, we said, is the first element of Robert Alexis' theory of balancing. The second element is the weight formula. The weight formula answers the question of how the theoretical law of balancing can aid the decision makers to manage real cases and obtain a concrete balancing outcome. And the weight formula is certainly the most innovative and at the same time the most criticized element of Alexis' balancing theory. This formula comprises the three factors of the law balancing, the one that I already discussed, which are abstract weight, intensity of interference, and the reliability of empirical premises, in order to obtain the concrete weight of the competing interests to reveal which one weighs more. And the third element of Alexis' structure of balancing is the burden of argumentation that operates when the application of the weight formula results in a stalemate, meaning when the weight of the principles are identical. So by applying the Alexis theory of balancing, the WTO judicial bodies have the opportunity to, first of all, strike a balance between trade and non-trade values, such as environmental protection, by structure rather than by chance, I would say. Second, it is useful to mitigate the implicit prima facie preeminence of free trade in trade contexts, and also to support a process of a harmonization of normative antinomies. As I said at the very beginning of this presentation, there are two kinds of issues preventing an effective balance between trade and non-trade issues. We just talked about the normative issues, but now we have to see which are the epistemic issues stemming from an international trade in biotech products. Okay, so as I explained, risks posed by biotech products to biosafety entail uncertainty. And this uncertainty lowers the reliability of empirical premises in the sense of the certainty of the underlying assumptions. Say that it is important to emphasize that the WTO judicial bodies have constantly rejected the national efforts to implement biosafety measures in trade context because of the lack of insufficient scientific evidence concerning the harmfulness of biotech products. This is because having insufficient scientific evidence is a requirement to implement one of the most important, I would say, article of that PS agreement, which is Article 5.7. Well, the scientific literature, we know that the scientific literature is plenty of studies analyzing the impact of biotech products on human health and the environment, right? So according to the WTO judiciary, this is the reason why there is not an insufficient scientific, there is not the lack of an insufficient scientific evidence in the context of biotech. It's plenty of studies in this regard. So according to the WTO panels and the appellate body, biotech cases lack the criterion of insufficient scientific evidence. But this is, however, not precise because biotech cases might be supported by sufficient scientific evidence from a quantitative point of view. Thousands of studies, true. However, what the WTO decision makers overlook is the fact that the body of scientific evidence in question is qualitatively insufficient as the high level of scientific uncertainty affects the reliability of the empirical premises at stake. Against this background, the question to address is how decision makers should address serious and potentially irreversible, but still uncertain environmental risks in the context of biotech, and not only, I would say. Well, carrying out a well-structured proportionality analysis is a valid means to address normative, but certainly not this kind of epistemic issues. So the implementation, the adoption, and the carrying out the well-structured proportionality analysis cannot help in this regard. So to answer this final question, we need to see how the assessment of technological risks is carried out, and which are the environmental tools to ensure environmental protection in spite of remaining scientific uncertainty. Well, as regards the risk assessment of the technology risks, it is widely agreed that our response to risk represent a key element in our response to new technologies. Consequently, it is pertinent to ask, how did we respond to technological risk? Besides, does the interpretation of risk develop by keeping pace with the complexity brought by biotech? So here, a brief discussion of how the interpretation of risk has developed over time can aid in this regard. So the notion of risk is changed over the time. So among all analysis of the development of the concept of risk, Beck's Risk Society represents definitely a landmark in the literature. The German sociologist identifies different approaches to risk over three main epochs: the pre-modern epoch, the modern epoch, and the late modern epoch. And remarkably, Beck's analysis highlights that industrialized society had already started sacrificing environmental protection for economic growth in the modern epoch, in which risks were interpreted through a more scientific approach. So understanding risk as a result of the so-called hand formula, which reads as gravity of harm times probability of harm, represents a very common quantitative interpretation of risk. There are scholars explaining that in the 18th century, the notion of risk started to be scientificized by drawing upon a mathematical concept relating to probability. So a quantitative approach to risk shapes, in turn, a quantitative risk assessment. However, as Weimer pointedly stresses, we encounter one of the major problems of applying a quantitative risk assessment to the assessment of a modern technological risks, such as, for example, biotechnology or nanotechnology. They are much less amenable to statistical calculation based on probability theory. Also, it has been noted that a quantitative interpretation of risk overshadows its social function. So against this background, other scholars underline that the sociological conceptualizations of risk are the only means to address technological risks, which are characterized by uncertainty. And in light of this, performing only a quantitative risk assessment to evaluate biotechnology risks would be misleading, I would say. This is because neither uncertainties nor hazards surrounding new technologies might be quantified. And this seems to be corroborated by the Australian National Report on best practice and current practice in ecological risk assessment for GMOs, which stresses that quantitative techniques are not currently available for all of the potential hazards associated with GMOs. Therefore, a quantitative risk assessment should be complemented by a qualitative assessment of risk. Qualitative assessments are recommended as they adopt techniques considering both scientific and societal discourses concerning biotech and more specifically GMOs. So carrying out an analysis of risk that relies on quantitative and qualitative assessments would provide a clearer picture of biotech products, not least because this combined approach would take into account a quantitative interpretation of risk as well as its social function. So, second, the second point to discuss regards the most relevant environmental obligations to ensure the environment in spite of remaining the scientific uncertainty. Well, traditionally, international environmental law focused on remedying actual damage or preventing identified hazards. This is called the preventive approach. So techniques to incorporate the idea of foresight beyond immediate cause and effect, in other words, being precautions into environmental law were lacking. Proactive approaches to potential future harm were not part of the legal vocabulary. Instead, the clear and convincing evidence of environmental harm was required. For instance, in the trial smelter case, but emerging consciousness of the delicate nature and the vulnerability of ecosystems gave rise to the recognition that this evidence-first approach created several problems. First of all, it ignored the fact that ecosystems are inherently complex. Consequently, any prediction of the effects of human activities upon them inevitably entails uncertainty, making it difficult, if not impossible, to provide clear and convincing evidence. And second, it did not take into account the time delay, with which many harmful effects become visible in the natural environment. So given this broad acknowledgement of a need to implement measures that could protect the environment without waiting for conclusive evidence on the environmental damage, several international conventions, agreements, protocols, and also declarations enshrined the so-called precautionary principle or approach. The precautionary approach or principle, however, lacked a single formulation. Some international instruments refer to the precautionary principle, while others address it as approach. As I said, it has been argued that the term approach entails more flexibility, and this might explain the trend in recent practice to adopt approach rather than principle. So the concept of precaution appears on the international scenario in 1972 when it was included in German law, and it operates with a proactive rationale. It calls for actions at an earlier stage, even if uncertainty remains about the harmfulness. So under the precautionary principle, the benefit of any doubt is to go to the environment. The so-called in dubio pro nature is the motto of the precautionary principle. And the current global, well, actually it's not current anymore, according to a few scientific studies, it is. The global pandemic taught us the importance of implementing precautionary measures. This is because while much uncertainty remained about the transmission and infectious potential of the virus, precautionary measures about social distancing measures were immediately introduced. And this significantly lowered the rates of new infections, meaning that precautionary measures can be really useful. Despite the lack of a single formulation of a precaution, scholars and decision makers widely agree on the three components defining the precautionary principle, which are risk of environmental or human health harm, uncertainty about harm to human health and the environment, and action at an early stage. So let's briefly discuss each of them. Risk of environmental or human health harm. Well, clearly, it would be unreasonable to invoke precaution daily risk to human lives. Therefore, the concept of a precaution must necessarily imply a minimum threshold of risk. Yet, a number of international instruments omit any specific threshold, and it is reasonable to think that there is no general threshold, as the evaluation of risk depends on the concrete case. As regards the second component of a precaution, the uncertainty on environmental harm, well, it is important here to stress that precaution does not apply because of uncertainty, but despite it. Concerns over environmental or human health harm are the trigger for precaution, not uncertainty. Further, the precautionary principle covers all types of uncertainty, like, for example, epistemic or ontological uncertainty, but not all levels of uncertainty. Otherwise, precaution would apply for every imaginary risk. This alarm charge, I don't know if you can hear it. 2 seconds. And importantly, one last point on uncertainty is that the application of a precaution is context dependent and thus will vary in different regimes. Last element, the third element of a precaution is the timely action aiming at avoiding damage to human health and or the environment. For instance, according to Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration, the precautionary approach requires measures to prevent environmental degradation. And without precautionary action at an early stage, precaution would be meaningless. And yet, this is precisely where the challenge lies. This is because there is no straightforward answer to the central question of how the rhetoric of a precaution can be translated into protective measures. In the view of international courts, precaution can entail a very cautious approach, a prudent approach, appropriate measures for the preservation of the environment or to prevent specific potential risks to public health, safety, and the environment, or even restrictive measures, any measure for the protection of the environment, protective measure, or even provisional risk management measures. So in light of this, we can assume that there is no exhaustive list of precautionary measures. And despite the fact that the precautionary principle is widely accepted on the international legal panorama, and despite the fact that it clearly represents a valid tool to address scientific uncertainty surrounding environmental matters, its implementation is hardly authorized for, I would say, 3 main reasons. First of all, precaution is interpreted as a static as opposed to dynamic tool that hinders technological development. Although commonly depicted as a legal tool standing primarily on the side of an environmental protection, I would say that the precautionary principle is a dynamic rather than a static tool supporting the adoption of biosafety measures. This is because the precautionary principle should be interpreted as a balancing and dynamic criterion supporting the implementation of biosafety measures, which are effective in achieving their goal and at the same time non-arbitrary and proportional to the competing interests in trading biotech. But success of this dynamic interpretation depends on precautionary measures being applied in light of 5 criteria. Biosafety measures triggered under the precautionary principle should be, first of all, effective, meaning capable of achieving the desired level of protection. Second, they should be proportionate to the objective desired level of protection and the risk at hand, and therefore the least trade restrictive measure in pursuing non-trade related domestic policy goals. 3, non-discriminatory and consistent, meaning not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail, or a disguised restriction on international trade. 4th, supported by a cost-effective analysis of actions and inactions and keeping pace with the development of science and accordingly re-examined from time to time in light of the development of scientific knowledge. Precautionary measures complying with these requirements can show the capacity of the precautionary principle to act as a balancing and dynamic criterion, which can aid WTO decision makers to address the epistemic issue surrounding the international trade in biotechnology. The second problem relates to the second problem, preventing an effective implementation of the precautionary principle relates to the fact that precautionary measures are hardly authorized by international courts. A main challenge is the tendency to perceive cases involving precautionary measures as false negatives. A study conducted in 2019 by the European Environmental Agency on 88 international cases underlining a judicial trend of international courts to overlook warnings about the harmfulness of some products or activities to human health or the environment highlights precisely this point. In almost all cases, requests for adopting precautionary measures have been rejected by decision makers who considered the issue at hand to be a false positive. False positives are cases in which regulatory authorities suspect that an activity poses a risk and act upon the suspected risk by implementing measures based on precaution, but this later turned out to be unnecessary. However, the EEA study concludes by showing that only 4 cases out of 88 fulfill the definition of regulatory false positive. This means that almost all cases were false negatives, meaning that earlier warnings existed, but no precautionary actions were taken. Thus, the EEA report invites consideration of the following lesson, and I quote, "Fear of false positives is misplaced and should not be a rationale for avoiding precautionary actions where warranted. False positives are few and far between as compared to false negatives, and carefully designed precautionary actions can stimulate innovation even if the risk turns out not to be real or as serious as initially feared." So, last issue, making quite hard the implementation of the precautionary principle concerns the lack of a sufficient level of harm and degree of scientific certainty to justify precautionary measures in the context of biotech. As the precaution does not apply for every minor or imaginary threat, a certain threshold of risk, that is gravity times probability of harm, must be reached. Establishing whether this threshold has been met might be particularly challenging for decision makers examining biotech cases. This is because there is no agreement among scientists on the gravity and the probability of biotech risks. So to remind us, in regard to the gravity of harm, there are, for instance, scientific studies claiming that the resistance of genetically engineered crops to certain antibiotics causes serious human health problems, while others say that no expert panel has ever identified like significant risk associated with use of antibiotic resisting marker. Similarly, scientists disagree also on the probability of occurrence of risks posed by biotechnology. A good example here is provided by the occurrence of harm posed by the use of glyphosate on biotech products. In 2015, the GNHRE classified this pesticide as probably carcinogenic to humans, while in 2016, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN panel of experts on pesticide residues in food and the environment, and also the World Health Organization, concluded that glyphosate is unlikely to pose a carcinogenic risk to humans from exposure through the diet. Well, consequently, the WTO judicial bodies dealing with legal disputes on international trade in biotech face unreliable empirical premises stemming from the uncertainties on the harm posed by these products to biosafety. And it is accordingly evident that establishing the evidentiary threshold that sufficient precaution to apply is very difficult and arguably confined to the discretion of the appointed panel. Against this background, the adoption of a scale of legal evidence and scientific uncertainty might guide WTO judicial bodies in evaluating the state of knowledge concerning the contested biotech products, and accordingly to set the precautionary evidentiary threshold on a case-by-case basis. The judicial adoption of a scale of legal evidence and scientific uncertainty might be, in fact, a source of lighthouse for WTO judicial bodies navigating the complex issues raised by the uncertainties surrounding biotech. As similar scales have not been developed yet, I try to fill this gap in my book, Biosafety Measures, Technology Risks, and the World Trade Organization, Thriving and Surviving in the Age of Biotech, where in chapter 8, I developed what I called a scale of legal evidence and scientific uncertainty, which is inspired by the work of other scholars and scientific committees. And this scale outlines a hierarchy of uncertainties, taking account of the probabilities of harm and the related standards of proof to apply in light of the considered levels of gravity. And it might help to mitigate the third problem, the third main problem, preventing effective implementation of the precautionary principle. And with this, I would conclude this presentation, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. I'm going to stop the recording just in case anyone wants to ask questions not on film.